Today, we are gathered for the UN at Haiti. The question is unavoidable. Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible.
My people, Kenya's President William Ruto just delivered one of the boldest speeches an African leader has ever delivered at the UN. He called out the failures of global institutions, from the UN itself to the World Bank and IMF, and demanded reforms that would finally give Africa a real seat at the table. And he didn't just stop there. From Palestine to Sudan, climate change to Haiti, he used Kenya's voice to speak for the entire global South, exposing the contradictions of a world order that claims to stand for justice, but too often only works for the powerful. My people, every once in a while, a speech breaks through, a speech that challenges the status quo, shakes the table, and demands the world to pay attention. Ruto's speech was definitely one of them. So today, we're breaking down his speech line by line and theme by theme to understand why it's being called a historic turning point, what it tells us about Africa's rising voice in global affairs, and whether his bold words can actually translate into real change. But before we break it down, please do me a favor and subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell for alerts. And if you enjoy this video, be sure to like, share, drop a comment, a super thanks, and join our membership for more exclusives. Also, we are hosting our annual conference and awards gala in New York City this November, the BlackStars Experience, and I'd love for you to join us. Visit BlackStarsExperience.com to learn more and to register. Hey there! Before we continue with the episode, I want you to quickly pause. Visit BlackStarsExperience.com and sign up for our upcoming conference in New York City this November. This is where leaders, allies, and change makers are coming together to open doors, share opportunities, and push the culture and the community forward. From our eye-opening discussions, expert-led sessions, to a career expo and networking opportunities, if you're serious about your career, your business, your future, you must be in the room. Because this is more than an event. This is a movement. It's about creating pathways for all of us to rise together. November 13th and 14th, New York City. Hey, don't just hear about it later. Be there. Secure your seat at the BlackStars Experience because your future deserves it. All right, now let's get back to the episode. Now, before we get into the breakdown, let's take a moment to talk about Kenya and about President William Ruto himself. Now, Kenya isn't just any African nation. It's a regional powerhouse, home to the UN's African headquarters, and a key player in peacekeeping, climate diplomacy, and regional mediation. When Kenya speaks at the UN, the world has to pay attention. President Ruto, who came to power in 2022, has styled himself as one of the continent's boldest voices on reforming the global order. He talks about fairness in global finance, climate justice, and Africa's demand for a seat at the table of international decision-making. And in many ways, he has positioned himself not just as Kenya's leader, but as a spokesperson of sort for Africa's frustration within the current system. But here's the twist. Back home in Kenya, Ruto is governing through real turbulence. His administration has faced major pushback over economic hardships, new tax policies, and public protests led by the opposition. Many Kenyans, the reality is, are struggling with the rising cost of living and feel that the government isn't delivering on its promises. And that context is important because while Ruto projects strength and statesmanship abroad, his political footing at home is far more contested. And that's what makes his speech so fascinating. On the world stage, Ruto speaks with confidence of a continental statesman. But back home in Nairobi, he's navigating a deeply divided political climate. And that tension between global ambition and domestic reality is part of the story of this moment. Now, let's get to his speech. He starts with an important history lesson.
Madam President, you can count on Kenya's full support throughout your tenure as you steer the Assembly into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, 8 years ago, in the aftermath of the unprecedented global destruction and devastating war, the international community came together in hope. They created this organization, the United Nations, as a shield against the horrors of war, as a platform for dialogue, and as a bridge to a better, fairer, more secure global community. What is often forgotten or not mentioned today is that the United Nations grew out of the failure of the League of Nations that existed between 1919 and 1945. The League of Nations did not collapse for lack of good intentions or noble objectives. Formed at the end of the First World War and as part of the Treaty of Versailles, it was humanity's first attempt to build a permanent international organization to stop aggression and war and bring nations together. Its ambitions were to achieve collective global security, disarmament, peaceful dispute resolution, and cooperation on humanitarian and social issues. Despite these ideals, the League of Nations failed. The United States never joined, other great powers came and went, and without enforcement authority, its condemnation carried little weight. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, and when Hitler openly defied its rules, the League stood by, helpless and powerless. By the late 1930s, its credibility had collapsed, and with the outbreak of the World War II, it was rendered irrelevant.
Now let's pause right here, because what he's doing is very important, and it's not to give us history for the sake of history. There is a purpose. This history is important because it shows a pattern. The League of Nations was humanity's first attempt to create a global system of governance to prevent wars, resolve disputes, and keep the peace. On paper, it looked revolutionary, but in reality, it couldn't enforce its own rules. When powerful nations ignored it, the League crumbled. And here's the lesson. Institutions don't fail because their ideas are wrong. They fail because they lose credibility. The moment people stop believing in the system, the moment its rules stop applying equally, the whole thing collapses. And that's why Ruto goes back to the League of Nations, because it's a reminder that no global institution, no matter how big or powerful, is immune from collapse if it doesn't live up to its promises. And why is he reminding us of this history? Let's keep going.
Madam President, this history is both a lesson and a warning. Institutions rarely fail because they lack vision or ideals. More often, they drift into irrelevance when they do not adapt, when they hesitate to act, and when they lose legitimacy. To remain relevant, institutions must be reimagined, must be reformed, renewed, and aligned with emerging realities. 8 decades ago, the founders of the UN sought to correct the failures of the League of Nations by creating a stronger, more inclusive organization anchored in the principles of, and I quote, "We the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," end of quote. Today, we are gathered for the UN at 80. The question is unavoidable. Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? Can it continue to serve humanity in the face of current realities? Or has it become a relic of a bygone era?
Now here's where Ruto sharpens the point. He takes the history lesson and turns it into a mirror for the present. Institutions, he says, don't fail because they lack ideals. They fail because they stop adapting. They drift, they hesitate, they lose legitimacy. And this is a powerful reframing. Because when we think about the UN, most of us picture it as this permanent fixture of global life. But what Ruto is reminding us is that no institution is immune to irrelevance. The same way the League once looked untouchable, the UN today could easily become a relic if it doesn't evolve. And notice how he does it. He invokes the original promise of the UN. We, the peoples, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's a founding vision rooted in hope and inclusivity, right? But then he contrasts it with a question. Is that vision still alive? Or has the UN become stuck in the past? Now, by framing it as a question, is the UN relevant or has it become a relic? He is forcing the global community to confront something uncomfortable. Because if leaders can't answer that question with confidence, then the very legitimacy of the UN is in doubt. Let's keep going.
The question is unavoidable. Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? Can it continue to serve humanity in the face of current realities? Or has it become a relic of a bygone era? Madam President, Excellencies, we meet against a grim global backdrop. Conflict rages in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and beyond. Climate disasters grow fiercer by the day. Inequality deepens, pandemics loom, and technological disruptions outpaces governance. Instead of trust, mistrust is spreading. Instead of solidarity, fragmentation is taking root. In place of hope, anxiety fills our global community. We are living, to borrow from the words of the founders of this institution, not in larger freedom, but in growing uncertainty. At this moment of turbulence, when we most need a strong United Nations, the organization faces its deepest crisis in credibility and capacity. Funding cuts have paralyzed its operations. Bureaucracy has slowed its response. The Security Council remains frozen in the post-war structures of 1945, unable to act inclusively, with fairness, and with speed.
And now he brings the argument right into the present. Notice how he stacks the crises, right? Wars in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, climate disasters, inequality, pandemics, technology outpacing governance. It's a rapid-fire list that's meant to overwhelm you, to really paint a picture of a world on fire, in chaos. Then he contracts what we need with what we actually have. Instead of trust, mistrust. Instead of solidarity, fragmentation. Instead of hope, anxiety. That's classic rhetorical framing, turning the UN's founding ideals upside down to show just how far we've drifted. And here's the punchline. At the exact moment when humanity most needs a strong United Nations, the UN itself is in its weakest state. Not just weak, in a deepest crisis of credibility and capacity. Now think about that. An institution meant to embody hope, now paralyzed by funding cuts, buried under bureaucracy, and frozen in the power structures of 1945. This is where the critique starts to bite. Because what he's saying is the UN isn't just failing because the world is chaotic. The UN is failing while the world is chaotic. And that gap between what the world needs and what the UN delivers is what makes the institution look irrelevant. Let's keep going.
Ladies and gentlemen, I can, however, state with absolute conviction that the United Nations has been one of humanity's greatest achievements. For 8 decades, it has held back the specter of global war, calmed conflicts from Cambodia to Liberia, and stood guard in some of the world's most dangerous places through the courage of its peacemakers and peacekeepers. Few institutions in humanity's history can claim such a legacy. The United Nations has stood at the front lines of humanitarian crisis, from famine relief in the Horn of Africa to emergency shelter for millions of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. It was at the forefront in the eradication of smallpox, coordinated global responses to HIV and AIDS, Ebola, and COVID-19, and continues to champion universal vaccination. Its agencies have advanced women's rights, protected children, safeguarded refugees, and set global norms on everything from disarmament to climate action. The UN Sustainable Development Goals remain a shared blueprint for human progress. These are achievements no nation could have achieved alone, however rich, however great, or however powerful. And yet, every institution, no matter how noble its origins or impactful its legacy, must adapt to changing times or slide into irrelevance. Today, the United Nations stands at a crossroads of renewal on one hand or decay on another. Put differently, after 80 years, the rhymes of time are calling on us to reimagine the original promise that inspired the founding of the United Nations, and that is the quest for global peace, development, and human rights. But this call must now be answered in a global context that is profoundly different from the post-war era in which the UN was conceived then. We would be denying the cold, hard truth if we say that the United Nations is delivering as it should. On peace and security, its voice is too often drowned by the rivalries of great powers, while some nations simply ignore its resolutions and do as they please. Too often, the UN's blue helmet, once a symbol of moral authority, no longer commands the same respect. From the conflicts in Gaza to Ukraine, to the crisis in Sudan, DRC Congo, Somalia, and the Sahel, we see actors proceed undeterred by the United Nations calls.
So here, Ruto makes an important pivot. After laying out the failures, he doesn't dismiss the UN entirely. Instead, he reminds the world that the UN is still one of humanity's greatest achievements. For 80 years, it has helped prevent global war, resolved conflicts, delivered humanitarian relief, and coordinated health responses that saved millions of lives. Now, this is a very smart move, because if Ruto had only attacked the UN, the message could be dismissed as hostile, right, or ungrateful. By honoring its achievements, he acknowledges the institution's legacy while still pressing the urgency for reform. So it's both respect and rebuke. But watch how he frames it. No matter how noble or impactful an institution may be, it must adapt or risk irrelevance. In other words, yes, past achievements are not a shield against present failures. The UN's proud history doesn't excuse its current paralysis. Then comes the sharper edge. He says the UN's voice is too often drowned out by great power rivalries. Its resolutions are ignored. Its peacekeepers no longer command the same respect they once did. And he names names: Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, the DRC, Somalia, the Sahel. These are real-world crises where the UN is sidelined, where actors simply do what they want despite UN calls. So what he's saying is this: the UN can point to its record, yes, but right now, in the crises of today, it is losing credibility. And if it cannot deliver on its core mandate of peace and security, then its proud history risks being overshadowed by present irrelevance. Let's keep going.
We see actors proceed undeterred by the United Nations calls. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Kenya speaks from the experience of a nation deeply invested in multilateralism. For decades, we have placed our troops and police in harm's way for peacekeeping missions across Africa and beyond, from Somalia to Democratic Republic of Congo, from South Sudan to most recently in our neighborhood here in Haiti. Over the past 15 months, we are proud to have led the multinational security support mission in Haiti, not because it has been easy, but because solidarity is the essence of the United Nations. Madam President, the mandate of the MSS mission is coming to an end in a few days. As the lead nation, allow me to briefly share our experiences, the successes and the challenges, as both a cautionary tale and a living lesson about the strengths and weaknesses of the current global security governance architecture. For far too long, the people of Haiti called out to the world. Too often, their pleas were met with silence, hesitation, or half measures. Haiti became a tragic reminder of what happens when the international community looks away, prevaricates, or offers half-hearted support. When Kenya responded to the quest for the Haitian authorities, it was in the belief that we were joining a genuinely multinational effort. We welcomed and fully embraced Resolution 2699, by which the United Nations Security Council authorized the MSS with Kenya as the lead nation. Drawing on our decades of peace support operations, we stepped forward, stepped up, and deployed our officers to confront the rampant menace of gang violence in Port-au-Prince and its environs. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the mission has operated in a volatile environment under enormous constraints. It has been underfunded, under-equipped, and operated below 40% of its authorized personnel strength. Our police officers have valiantly shouldered responsibilities without the full logistical support that would accompany any mission sanctioned by the United Nations. Despite these challenges, and against all odds, the MSS has delivered results many thought were impossible. The presidential palace, once under siege from gangs, is today restored as the seat of government. The police headquarters and the police training center, once overrun by gangs, are now secure, with the academy resuming the training of new police officers, over 700 of whom graduated a few months ago. Schools that have been shattered by violence have reopened, with children back in class, learning and progressing. Roads once manned or blocked by gangs have now free-flowing traffic. Cases of kidnapping and extortion have reduced sharply. The airport and the seaport, once surrounded by gangs, are now abuzz with normal operations. Which begs the question, if so much could be achieved with limited resources and stretched personnel within just 15 months, what more could have been accomplished if the United Nations fraternity had truly acted together in solidarity with the people of Haiti? From this podium, I wish to assure all partners and actors that with the right personnel, adequate resources, appropriate equipment, and necessary logistics, Haiti's security can be restored. Gangs can be neutralized and the safety of streets, schools, hospitals, and homes secured. The continued harassment, abductions, and criminal acts undermining the lives of Haitians are unacceptable, unjustifiable, and must be stopped by this organization, the United Nations.
Now, this is one of the most striking parts of Ruto's speech, because he shifts from theory to lived experience. He says, Kenya isn't talking about multilateralism. We've put skin in the game for decades. Kenyan troops and police have served on UN peacekeeping missions across Africa, and now in Haiti. Now, by highlighting Haiti, Ruto personalizes the failures of the UN system. He points out that for years, Haitians cried out for help, and the world mostly looked away. When Kenya stepped up to lead the multinational mission, it wasn't because it was easy. It was because, as he puts it, solidarity is the essence of the United Nations. But here's a catch. Even though the mission was authorized by the Security Council, it was underfunded, under-equipped, and operating at, get this, less than 40% of its authorized strength. That's a damning indictment. Kenya was asked to lead, but the so-called multinational support was never truly multinational. And yet, despite all those constraints, he points to real progress. Gangs pushed back, schools reopened, police back in training, ports and airports functional again. He's saying, look, even with scraps, we made a difference. Imagine what could have been achieved if the international community had actually stood in solidarity with Haiti. That's both a defense of multilateralism and an attack on how it actually works in practice. He praises what has been achieved, but uses it as evidence of how broken the system is when the poorest countries are left to carry the burden without real backing. And then he lands the moral punch. The harassment, abductions, and violence against Haitians are unacceptable. They must be stopped. And it is the UN's responsibility to stop them. So my people, here Ruto makes Haiti more than just a case study, right? It becomes a symbol of what solidarity could look like if the UN truly lived up to its promise, and a symbol of how much credibility the UN loses when it doesn't.
Madam President, as the UN Security Council deliberates on the next steps, we must not lose sight of the fact that the situation in Haiti demands sustained, coordinated, and undivided international attention. A careful and orderly transition from MSS is essential to consolidate the hard-won gains so far achieved. I urge the Security Council and all partners to remain steadfast in ensuring that Haiti moves forward on a path of peace, stability, and renewal. Ladies and gentlemen, on human rights, our principle is clear and unwavering. The protection of civilians and respect for humanitarian law cannot be applied selectively. We cannot condemn suffering in one place and turn a blind eye in another. Kenya is gravely concerned by the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and by the immense suffering of civilians caught in the devastation of disproportionate military operations. At the same time, we call for the unconditional release of Israeli hostages. In line with the African Union and United Nations resolutions, we also call for a permanent ceasefire, for strict adherence to international humanitarian law, and for the launch of a credible political process. Only through such a process can the vision of a two-state solution be realized, where Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace, security, and stability. Kenya is equally deeply troubled by the worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan, where innocent citizens are caught in the crossfire of a needless war. We fully endorse the Quad, comprising Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, in affirming that there cannot be a military solution and that only political dialogue offers a viable path forward. We join the Quad in urging all parties, including SAF, RSF, and the external actors, to respect Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and firmly reject any attempts to divide the country, reaffirming our unwavering support for a unified Sudan for the benefit of all its people.
And after using Haiti as a case study, Ruto zooms out again to the bigger picture. And this is where his speech takes on a global moral authority. First, he insists that Haiti cannot be abandoned midway. The gains, fragile as they are, will collapse if the world doesn't commit to seeing the mission through. This is an important point. He's not just criticizing, he's showing what sustained solidarity should look like. It's about follow through, not half measures. Then he pivots to human rights. And here, his words are sharp. He says, humanitarian law cannot be applied selectively. Ooh, that's a direct challenge to the double standards that dominate global politics, right? We can't condemn atrocities in one region and ignore them in another. And he applies it immediately to Gaza. Kenya condemns the disproportionate suffering of civilians under military operations, calls for a permanent ceasefire, demands adherence to international law, and at the same time insists on the unconditional release of Israeli hostages. This balanced framing matters. It rejects one-sided narratives and instead calls for a credible political process to achieve a two-state solution. Now, that's a bold stance for an African leader to take on the UN stage. And from there, he turns to Sudan. He makes it clear there is no military solution to this conflict. Kenya throws its weight behind the Quad, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the US, but also emphasizes Sudan's sovereignty and unity. In other words, yes, outside meddling or attempts to divide the country are unacceptable. The through line here is consistency. Whether it's Haiti, Gaza, or Sudan, Ruto is making one big claim. The rules have to apply everywhere, for everyone. If the UN wants to be credible, it cannot afford to pick and choose where international law matters. Let's keep going.
Madam President, in the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions were created to stabilize the global economy and rebuild war-torn Europe. At that time, their design reflected the power and interest of the victorious nations, who were also their primary shareholders and beneficiaries. The IMF was tasked with upholding the gold standard exchange rate system, while the World Bank was established to finance Europe's reconstruction. Both have since evolved into development finance institutions, but their structures, decision-making, and governance remains dominated by wealthy nations. Today, the global context is vastly different. The global standard collapsed 5 decades ago, and Europe has long since been rebuilt. Yet, the governance of these institutions has not kept pace with needs of a multipolar world, especially the needs of poor and developing nations. The mismatch between shareholders and stakeholders has become starkly visible. For instance, during the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy nations. Just imagine, 64%. With little need for liquidity support. They didn't need the money anyway, but they got 64%. While the poorer countries received just 2.4%. What a disconnect. The imbalance highlights how the very institutions meant to safeguard global finance stability often perpetuate inequality and instability. I have argued, and I say it again, that the current global financial architecture punishes poor countries with high interest rates and enormous conditionalities, while rewarding rich nations with lower interest rates and softer lending rates. Its rules, priorities, and allocation mechanisms consistently favor those already prosperous, while trapping vulnerable economies in cycles of debt, high borrowing costs, and inadequate access to emergency support and concessional funding. It is imperative to transform these institutions into genuinely independent, apolitical global bodies that their operations are aligned with their global mandate. Such a shift would democratize decision-making, restore credibility, and allow the IMF and the World Bank to serve all countries fairly rather than reinforcing old hierarchies. But Africa is not merely waiting for external prescriptions. We are taking bold and deliberate steps to strengthen our financial independence, safeguard our stability, and accelerate our development. Kenya, for instance, fully endorses the establishment of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, launched with the Africa Union in February 2024. This alliance brings together our homegrown banks, Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Africa Re, Africa Development Bank, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEPRI, institutions that embody Africa's determination to mobilize resources, finance trade, and build resilience on our own terms. At the same time, the Africa Union is championing three transformative institutions: the Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money; the Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty; and the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established.
Now, this is where Ruto goes beyond calling out the UN. Now he takes aim at the global financial system itself. He reminds us that the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, were not built for Africa or Asia or Latin America. They were designed after World War II to rebuild Europe and to reflect the power of the victors. And here's a key point. 80 years later, those power structures haven't changed. He lays it out clearly. These institutions have evolved on paper, but in practice, they are still dominated by wealthy nations. Their rules, their voting shares, their decision-making, all tilted to benefit the same countries that designed them. And the SDR allocation is his smoking gun. When the IMF issued hundreds of billions in special drawing rights during the pandemic, 64% went to rich nations who didn't even need the money, while the poorest countries, the ones most desperate for liquidity, got less than 3%. That's not just unfair. He says that's absurd. And here's where the argument gets sharper. The very institutions meant to provide stability are actually perpetuating instability. Poor countries are punished with sky-high interest rates and crushing conditionalities. Meanwhile, rich countries borrow cheaply and flexibly. The system is designed to reward wealth and penalize vulnerability. But Ruto doesn't stop at critique. He makes a pivot. Africa is not sitting around waiting for reform from outside. Africa is building its own financial infrastructure. He points to the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, bringing together Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the African Development Bank, Shelter Afrique, and others, as proof that Africa is mobilizing its own capital. Then he raises the stakes. The African Union is laying the groundwork for its own central bank, a monetary fund, an investment bank, and even its own credit rating agency, which I've talked about here on the show. This is a bold vision, because what he's really saying is, if the global financial system won't evolve, Africa will build a parallel system that reflects its own realities, values, and ambitions. This is a radical shift in tone from dependency to agency, because for decades, African leaders have gone to the UN and Bretton Woods meetings to plead for fairness. So here Ruto is flipping that script. No. Africa is not begging anymore. We will not beg. But look at what we're doing. We are building. Now let's go to the part of his speech that will be remembered for years to come.
Excellencies, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, Africa also marks 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the City Declaration, the two historic milestones that establishes the common African position on UN Security Council reforms. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. If the United Nations is to remain relevant in this century, it must reflect today's realities, not the post-war power arrangements of 1945.
Now this right here is the climax of Ruto's address, the moment the entire speech builds toward. He ties Africa's frustration to the very legitimacy of the UN itself. For 20 years, Africa has had a clear, united position on UN Security Council reform. They have demanded justice, equity, and representation at the highest table of decision-making. But here's the reality. For 2 decades, that demand has been brushed aside, endlessly debated, or outright ignored. And Ruto calls it out plainly. You cannot call yourself the United Nations while silencing the voice of 54 member states. That's half the moral weight of this institution. Dismissed. Then he delivers the gut punch. Africa is the only continent without permanent representation on the Security Council. Think about that. A continent of 1.4 billion people, providing some of the largest peacekeeping troops, hosting most of the Security Council's agenda, and bearing the highest cost of instability, but still no seat at the table where decisions about our own future are made. Make it make sense. And Ruto doesn't mince words. He says Africa deserves at least 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the veto, plus 2 additional non-permanent seats. And here's the brilliance of his framing. He doesn't present this as Africa begging for inclusion. He flips it. Security Council reform is not a favor to Africa. It's a matter of survival for the UN itself. Ooh. Because an institution that excludes the fastest growing continent in the world, the very continent where most of its peace and security debates take place, is an institution on borrowed time. And he made that very clear. And this is why many will remember Ruto's Anga speech as one of the boldest by an African leader in recent history. He's not just asking for a seat at the table. He's telling the world the table itself will not stand without Africa. So, my people, where do we go from here? President Ruto's speech at the 80th UN General Assembly wasn't just another diplomatic address. It was a line in the sand, a reminder that Africa will no longer accept being the subject of global debate while excluded from the decisions. A warning that the very credibility of the UN itself depends on whether it finally lives up to its founding promise of equality among nations. And that's why this speech matters, because it's not just about Africa asking for a seat. It's about reimagining what global governance should look like in the 21st century. Either the UN reforms to reflect today's realities, or it risks going the way of the League of Nations, remembered for ideals, but irrelevant to its time. My people, history is watching. The question is whether the world will listen. And more importantly, what does Africa do if it doesn't? And now I turn it over to you. What did you think about this speech? Which part hit you the most? Let me know in the comments and let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your group chats and let the world know that Africa is charting a new path forward. That's it for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Sandra Babu-Boateng. And until next time, take care. Hey you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.